Hello everybody, and welcome to another episode of the podcast, an unofficial IB podcast made by IB students for IB students and other people alike. And today, our special guest is
Miss Nicole, my bio teacher, the CAS advisor at our school, and also a TOK teacher. So it's safe to assume she has quite the experience with the IB diploma. But how long? Generally though, like how long have you actually been teaching this curriculum?
Oh, okay. So I've been teaching IB chemistry the longest, and I have been teaching that curriculum since 2007. So it's about 14 years.
Oh.
And I can't actually remember when I started teaching IB bio, probably around 2010, 2011. And then most recently teaching TOK. At the same time, I was appointed the CAS coordinator for RAS.
But only recently for TOK?
This is my 4th year teaching TOK.
Well, as a CAS advisor, which strand do you find students to struggle with most, if any, really?
I think it really depends on the student. I think from a program perspective, I'm always interested in getting students to think carefully about their service to make sure it's authentic and meaningful and is that reciprocal service that we strive for, not simply a doing unto others. And I think that takes a little bit of true advising and education around that process. But we have such a robust service learning program and service opportunities that in terms of finding those opportunities, students don't struggle so much unless they've been very removed from the service program. So for that one, for me, it's more of a quality issue than a quantity issue. And then you get two other kinds of students. The student maybe who hasn't been very physically active and does not enjoy or hasn't participated in team sports, and so then has to think about how they're going to have that physical activity component. But I think once we have that conversation and realizing, well, that can be individual and it can be going to the gym, it can be walking on a daily basis, it's about that healthy lifestyle, that usually resolves pretty quickly. And sometimes it's been a nice place for friends to get together and take those dance lessons or Thai boxing lessons that they've always wanted to do and haven't had a chance to do. And then for creativity, students that feel quite inhibited in the arts, then make a shift. But then we have this discussion about, well, creativity isn't just visual and performing arts. That's a wonderful outlet for creativity, but any academic creativity is creative. Any product you create is creative. So this podcast you are making is creative, right? So in answer to your question, what do we struggle with most? Sometimes it's changing our mindset around maybe our preconceptions about what a strand is, and then once students get over that, actually it works itself out pretty well.
A lingering question I've always kind of had about the action component in CAS at least is, you said that people can just do something regularly like going to the gym, and that would count as like a CAS experience for action, but would you say that only doing that is enough really for action? Considering it's one maintained activity, but essentially it's still one activity at the end.
Okay, so this is a good example that can be applied to a lot of CAS experiences, especially they're individual. So if I'm a student who recognizes, you know what, I need to be a little bit more active and I need a regular commitment. So starting in grade 11, CAS year 1, I am developing a program for myself where I'm going to do yoga once a week, or I'm going to go to the gym, 3 times a week, and I'm developing a program for myself from that point. I'm learning new skills, I'm growing, I'm showing commitment, I'm meeting those learner outcomes. So yes, it's individual, but that works out quite well. But that's a little bit different than the student who is a committed athlete and since grade 8 has been going to the gym and has their regular routine. So now when I'm starting in grade 11 and doing that CAS experience, I need to think a little bit, okay, where's the growth? Am I doing the same routine I've been doing since grade 8? Or am I now
Weight.
working with a trainer to develop my weight program and combine that with flexibility? So it really depends where we're starting, right? I think as a pianist, right, you understand that it'd be a very different situation. Do you play an instrument, Shin?
I played the saxophone a little bit.
Okay, do you play piano?
I do not play piano.
Okay, so here we have a great example. Shin committing for the first time to piano lessons, right? He'd be at a very different spot than you
Just
saying,
continuing my piano practice. Too.
right, and not setting goals about, okay, but this year it's the Rachmaninoff or it's the Schubert I've always wanted to
See
play.
how much I can break my hands this year.
Right. So I think that's how you can look at those individual ones. Is where's the growth, and so that's what I always bring students back to is where's the learner outcome in this.
So it's less of a checklist from what I'm hearing here, and more just a relative experience for students to fulfill. Like you said, like that concept of growth.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
you essentially just need to incorporate into your past experiences and make sure to reflect those.
Yeah, it's that question, does this count for CAS? Actually, one of the slides that we do at the beginning of the year, but I guess it gets kind of lost. I should probably make a poster of it, right? Is rather than ask, does it count, is does it fulfill the learner outcomes? Do I enjoy it? Am I growing? Am I new? Am I collaborating, right? And that often answers the question for the student. Yeah.
So you would kind of say that it is important for students to describe their starting point within their CAS reflections, is it not? So that coordinators will be able to know what point they're coming from?
Sure. Yeah, and I think you hit on a good point there, Shin, about where does the reflection come in then. So when we look at stages for CAS that are often connected with stages for service learning as well, that reflection doesn't need to occur when the experience is finalized, right? We can start by describing the experience and the intent for it, and then we can reflect a little bit, where am I at with this? How am I progressing? Now that I'm finished, how did I do, right? And using that approach, well, there's at least three reflections right there. There's a bit of a journey spelled into that, and that's where the power of the portfolio comes in. And then it's less repetitive from the description as well.
Would you also believe that, for example, by having students, set specific goals and all these kind of stuff, it's kind of being a beneficial for them in the future as sort of a takeaway for their careers, and like setting life goals and such?
So the planning aspect?
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, the planning serves two purposes. From a pragmatic perspective, it ensures or shows the advisor that you are going to be successful with this, because you are meant to commit 18 months on a fairly weekly basis. So if that's not put into a plan, right, we can get students slipping through the cracks. But as you say, more important benefit to the student is this life skill of planning and thinking about how CAS, which is not graded, not part of the 45 points, not externally moderated, how is that going to fit into my very, very busy life as an IB student, right? And valuing that component to bring balance and creativity to the diploma.
And so those are some, like, in terms of big takeaways that you can get from CAS itself, would you argue like just that long-term planning goal is the biggest one, or do you think there are like a few more components that can be added to it too?
I mean, I think students do pretty well putting together plans here. We're overall a pretty organized student body. So commitment and prioritization, I think, are a bigger area of growth, or something that needs to be thought about a little bit more deliberately for an RES student, because we tend to prioritize academics so heavily, and that test that's the next day, and that club meeting that I need to go to, that thinking about my CAS plan is sort of easily put on the back burner. So the plan is not really the hard part. It's the prioritization, or even if you're very busy, like both of you were in the school play, and so that kind of took care of itself on that experience, right? Just by being involved in that. When did you take the time to reflect on it, though? did you reflect as you were going through the play? Did you reflect all at the end? Are you realizing, whoops, I forgot, now it's year 2, and I should probably go put a reflection in there, right? So I think from an RAS student perspective, the intention is not the hard part, it's the commitment.
But when you mention reflection, though, do you mean actually writing it down or thinking about it? Because I feel students are constantly, well, not students in general, but there are a lot of people who are constantly thinking about the actions that they've done and reflecting in their mind rather than down on paper.
Yeah, unfortunately though, that's then, although that is a very valuable life skill, it is retained with you. So in terms of evidence to your program, your teachers, then it does need to go. It does need to be documented. But I think that's also why the IB has for the wealth of experience that students do here, the bar is actually pretty low for how many actual reflections and learner outcomes meet a minimum requirement, right? We tend to hold you a little bit more accountable because of the matching of values credit as well. So we tend to set the bar a little bit higher. But by all means, if you are, involved in eco-merits and you go on 3 trips and you choose to, one of them, you're just, you do some reflection on your own and you're not too fussed about documenting it, that's not actually a problem. I think the reflection shouldn't get in the way of meaningful growth, and ultimately if you are gaining from it, that's what's important. So you don't, I think the point being, you don't actually have to reflect on everything in the portfolio. You pick where it's meaningful. Yeah. And that takes away from it being a rote exercise and losing that impact.
So on the topic of reflection, do you think maybe CAS, maybe just a little bit has some sort of, slight negative impact on the students' intention? Like perhaps students may already have the intention to want to do something good, but since they're taking the IB dip, they're just kind of, stuffing it into CAS because it's something, and maybe I'm not sure, it may lose some of the good intentions or a little bit, but I do feel
I agree with Shin, but I also think there's another perspective to look at it from too. However, I'll save that for later if you want to go under it.
Well, I think we're speaking to stress, right? We're speaking to, I'm trying to do all these parts of a very ambitious program, and where's the time to fit the CAS component in? And I think there's a few ways to look at this. So one maybe misconception, or one way we can make things a little easier for ourselves, is to be reminded that CAS is not fully this extra component. So when you come into grade 11, you've been part of the high school, most of you have been part of a high school for already 2 years. You probably already have some athletic, creative, and service commitments, or at least one of those, right? And so the idea is to start your plan by thinking, how do I extend on those? How do I keep committing to those so that I'm not taxing myself with a whole other CAS plan on top of those? And so if I'm already part of Habitat for Humanity, I start to look at my relationship with that group and thinking now about learner outcomes. So I think about being a club member in a more sophisticated way, or in a more impactful way, or in a way that leaves a legacy when I am graduating in grade 12. And I think on that first point, if we try to make the most of what we're already doing, that might actually take some of the stress out, because we'd be more efficient rather than trying to think like, oh, and then I have to do all this other stuff. Well, no, it's meant to be sort of a continuum of where possible. Now, inevitably, you do have to stretch a little bit too. So if you're not involved in any creative endeavors, or, joining the play in grade 11 was a first, right? And CAS gave you that impetus to do that. Well, I mean, that's wonderful. That's great. I think now perhaps with our core class, which you were not benefiting from, but the cohort below you and continuing, hopefully, will have this core class that is parallel to their TOK class. And I think what I'm noticing with the year ones is that space is giving some pastoral time for working on the portfolio, thinking a little more deeply about CAS. And so maybe where's the time to do the reflection or do the more like the paperwork, the accounting bit, right? There's actually time, maybe a little bit more time provided for diploma students so that they don't feel so overwhelmed in doing it all in their own time. So that hopefully will be a cultural difference that helps with that piece as well.
Well, I'm just going to divert this to another topic real quick, but for IB students and, well, our school, we had this period of time where we were just working completely online, correct? And I guess in this virtual landscape that we were in, did you think CAS could still be easily pursued without a school environment to facilitate it?
I think it depends on the student. For some, actually not having a commute and sort of being home-based actually does open up some opportunities, right? So if you, maybe it's not everybody at your age that likes to garden, right? But maybe being home a little bit more gave you that time to spend with, a garden outside or plants in your house. And just as an example. So, and sometimes the time that was saved could be redirected. I think the biggest shift was probably in assuming we could do direct service. And then, I had all this direct service planned. How am I going to shift gears there? And so that's where maybe thinking about our three other kinds of service, indirect, advocacy, and research, especially advocacy and research, how can we still have a reciprocal relationship or advocate for a group, but we're going to have to do that in a slightly different format. Quite a few groups actually have launched some podcasts, right? So wanting to have a conversation and speak on issues, a podcast is a rather remote way to accomplish that. So I think there has actually been some creative thinking. I would say RAS has not been quite as impacted as maybe some other communities.
Definitely.
Yes. So we didn't really lower the bar. We just sort of tried to give you some opportunities to engage in different ways. Doing some other webinars actually I received lots of emails from groups that had tried to find solutions to this non-direct way of engaging with other groups, and some of you engaged with that.
Do you have some examples of things people could possibly do though on a virtual landscape?
Yeah, so one of the organizations I get emails from still is Operation Wallacea, and so they shifted to a whole online lecture series because they knew they weren't going to be getting as many, or if any, high school groups visiting. So there were the online lectures, and then they offered these internship programs, and this is kind of a common approach from many. So there was sort of an academic engagement there that occurred, with possibly some service or connection with particular projects. And so they offered this as an alternative to actually being on site.
Well, I know that CAS is supposed to be, I guess, a long-term thing that's supposed to happen over the first year and the second year. But considering that the second year of IB is generally going to have a much stricter workload on the students, would you say that maybe prioritizing CAS in your first year of IB would be a better choice, just to get more experiences in during that time to maybe reflect over and grow more?
Yeah, it's a tough one. In your work and impact in grade 11 doesn't mean you can not engage with CAS in grade 12. So there does need to be that minimum weekly commitment over the 18 months. Certainly starting the CAS project maybe in grade 11
might be a good idea.
And having that emphasis earlier on is wise. Perhaps to doing something that's very new or a little bit more on the ambitious side might be easier in grade 11, but we can't go as far to say do twice as much in grade 11 so you can lighten it all up in grade 12. That approach doesn't follow the philosophy, because ultimately what CAS is doing, it's setting you up for lifelong habits related to health, creative thought, and service to humanity, right? And of all the programs you do, you might be passionate about the courses you're taking, but at some point you're going to have to specialize. And half that program you took is going to fade, right? It will have prepared you, would have given you a good skill set, it will have challenged your brain. But although I was an excellent calculus student, I can't write a calculus paper at this point because I don't use it, right? I have memory of concepts and I know the intent behind it, but I can't actually sit and write that exam anymore to the level I once did. But do I consider myself a creative person who wants to engage in service? And am I trying to build a healthy lifestyle for my family and for myself? Yes. And so if we box CAS into, well, we only do it this month, or we do it in the summer when we're not doing our schoolwork, that's not really the point, right? So actually, to one of your other questions, quality versus quantity, much better to see a portfolio that showed ongoing engagement in fewer experiences than one-offs, huge breaks, one-offs, huge breaks, with little reflective ability, right, or capacity.
There are going to be some experiences that are continuous, correct, in a CAS experience?
Yeah, like varsity sports.
Those are always going to be present there. And if you have those three strands built, like a continuous experience for all those three strands, but just in your first year, sprinkle in more of those independent individual events, like perhaps joining a concert and playing for it, etc., etc.
I guess it depends how challenging it all is for you, right? So some students, 20 experiences in their first years, it's also just who they are and what they like to do. For others, getting in 5 is a challenge, or is the right challenge, right, I should say. So it's so qualitative that it's really hard to compare one student to another. So the criteria are kind of fairly generalized on that. But yeah, continuity is good. Trying something new is valuable, or pushing yourself to new limits in something you already do. I mean, these would be common ways to think about it.
But certainly with students with different style, like doing work, I mean, there's obviously going to be students who are able to get it more consistently, whereas there may be students who would prefer doing like bigger projects instead of smaller projects over time.
Yeah, and that's where the meaning comes in too, I think. You're right, like the play is finite, right? But it's a very intense experience, and it's maybe not something then you do, I mean, nice if you can do it in grade 11 and grade 12 and see that growth, but even having the one experience is quite valuable. So yes, absolutely, there's going to be, everyone's looks a little different, for sure.
And you say that's like the relativist aspect of CAS, right? Where it's independent to each student for what makes a valuable CAS experience as a whole, right?
Yeah, and I think if the student is proud of what they've accomplished and looks back on that and says, that's a nice piece to my high school career, and I value what that brought to my high school experience, then that's been successful. And it's partly why we do the Reflections magazine and have you contribute. I mean, you get a physical copy of that, and it's a nice reminder of what you did with your classmates.
What are some pitfalls you think students can fall into when, I guess, building up their CAS experience portfolio?
I had that question on here somewhere. Oh, here we go. But I see less of this now, actually. It used to be planning the service trip over meeting the authentic need. So it was, I've designed a t-shirt, I'm gonna raise funds, I'm gonna give it to the orphanage, but we've never visited the institution. We don't really know what their needs are. We don't know how much money they need. So that's one pitfall. I see a little bit less of that now, so I think we're doing a good job at changing that mindset or shifting it so that the authentic need is met a little bit more first, or there's more awareness about what that need is. So that's good. And then I suppose the reflecting after, treating reflection as an afterthought or as that is done last in the sequence rather than that's an ongoing. And I think you made a point earlier about we have reflective students. Some of you are very good at reflecting, and you are doing this as you're going through experiences. Sometimes, though, it is important to communicate to others, right? So if we hold everything inside, or we know it's there is value in that, but at some point others need to see that too. So getting that documentation done earlier and regularly and having a pattern of that would be maybe the other piece. But actually, I'm always pretty impressed at the variety that I see.
Reflections or experiences?
Just, the portfolios in general. I think there's always like polishing and tweaking, but I think with the new structure in place, especially because it's tied in with your values credit, there's a lot of good work being done.
Well, you say that about reflections, and certainly doing it reflecting after you completed your experience and not as an afterthought is certainly a way to increase the authenticity of your reflection. But what do you think are some other good qualities for a reflection that you think students can keep out forward? Do you think it's more of an intuitive thing that students should just do and reflect on what they believe they've gone over and improved over, rather than trying to follow a specific guideline or checklist, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, reflections can look quite different. There's no, and different experiences might merit a different depth of reflection. One thing that maybe makes it different from that initial description of what you were doing, though there may be descriptive elements, like this is what we ended up doing, right, is that you also want to see what the students' takeaway is in terms of connecting back to the learner outcomes. So while I was, setting up for a particular event, realizing where some of the challenges were or where some of the collaboration fell through, how did I overcome those challenges? Maybe one thing that transfers from academic work but isn't necessarily helping the reflective process is this feeling of a reflection should show the accomplishments and the perfection behind what I did, and when that's not there, students maybe feel like it wasn't a success or it somehow didn't meet the goal. And reflection is detached from that. It's your feelings and your growth and what was successful and what was non-successful. That is all very valuable in reflection. And one thing about the impact on your cohort as we prepare these pieces for the magazine, I think more than ever, because some of your projects are perhaps less visual, right? Haven't necessarily been as much direct service, and that's perfectly fine. But where there's been more creative product that's less visible, perhaps, is also recognizing what was the journey that brought you here. Like maybe your intentions a year ago were to do project A,
but now it's all shifted. So.
Right, and recognizing that that's an important part of that piece. I mean, obviously at some point you're going to want to talk about your actual project, but those reflections are going to be very interesting to read, not because of all the perfect successes, but because of the resilience that they need to show.
Well, so now that we talked about, being persistent, consistent is a very crucial thing in setting up a good reflection and building a good CAS portfolio. What do you think maybe one little tip or little advice that, though minor, can be very game-changing in terms of building a good portfolio, or one that isn't quite up to the...
I think if I was told, I'm going to start a CAS program tomorrow, and I want to be pragmatic but meaningful in my reflections, I think this piece of advice about committing to fewer learner outcomes per experience. And so even if, maybe joining, since you both joined the play. So when you joined the play, that was a pretty big endeavor, right? So you might easily have been able to identify 5 learner outcomes that you could have satisfied with that. Sometimes it can be more effective just to focus on 1 or 2, and then when you write that reflection, you only need to speak, or the depth you give on the 1 and 2, maybe then is a little bit easier than trying to do justice to all 5. So I think having that focus when it comes to reflecting, and not feeling like for everything I do, especially if they're very big, that I have to reflect on multiple learner outcomes each time. Because the requirement is hitting each one once throughout the 18 months. Right? That's a pretty reasonable ask, right? So if students really think, okay, I'm going on the eco-merits trip, I'm really going to think about the global local significance on this one. Or I'm in Amnesty and we're going to be visiting with refugee vulnerable populations, or we're having someone do a guest speak, I'm really going to think about the ethics of that, right? And so if we have these focuses, I think then they start to sound more original, more unique, they're more fun to write. If I'm trying to do everything every time, it probably gets a little bit more daunting. So.
But on reflections, and I guess what you mentioned there, them being fun to write, for students though, I don't know, philosophically at least for CAS as a whole, do you think CAS is trying to teach students the importance of reflection, or more so how to reflect over their actions?
I think the IB program in general values reflection as a life skill, because many of the IAs and the EE now require reflection. So yeah, I think the math IA maybe requires reflection. So there's this, it's not isolated to CAS, though that might be one of the earlier components where it's been integrated, but your extended essay requires reflection. I mean, if I think about my day-to-day job now, right, of those learner outcomes there, I spend probably more of my time thinking about the soft skills than the knowledge, thinking-oriented skills, because ultimately I am teaching similar materials. So, I do engage in my own intellectual development, but when it comes to that actual class setting, I do a lot of time thinking, okay, did that lesson go well? Is the lesson I delivered to period 2 going to work with period 3? There's a lot of reflection that goes into being more effective at what we do, how we interact with other people, how we make things better, right? And how we feel more satisfied with how things are going. So I think it's teaching you that if you reflect and you slow down and you think about carefully about, even if it didn't go great, you're now better prepared for the next time. Yeah.
So it's very sort of future-oriented in that sense, or just?
Well, I think it's deliberately worked in because I think it's important to fulfilling the ultimate sort of vision and mission of the IB, which, if you read the mission and vision, it is labeled as a rigorous academic program, but the goal is to create better citizens. So, reflection is an important part of that.
Right. Enough time has passed.
Well, that seems like a good
Okay.
note to end on.
Thanks.
So again, thanks for
Thank you, Mr.
joining
Paul,
us,
Thank you for coming in. I hope
and
you make time
thanks
for
to
this.
you few listeners that we have, and we hope to have you here the next time again.
For the next episode.